Welcome to the Project Exodus podcast series on OFM podcasts. Join us weekly as we explore critical topics on addiction and recovery through insightful discussions, heartfelt interviews, and practical Q&A sessions with members of the Project Exodus team and community. Project Exodus is dedicated to making expert recovery interventions accessible to all communities. Through this podcast series, our hope is that understanding and support for those on the path to recovery will be enhanced. Whether you're personally recovering, supporting someone else, or just curious, join us in building a community of awareness, compassion, and hope.
So welcome to our Project Exodus podcast series. Today we have got Lolo with us and Josh, both from the Project Exodus team. Thank you guys for being here today.
Hello.
It's so good to have you with us. So today we are doing a Q&A session on comprehending addiction. And so we've had some feedback from the community and some questions, and so we're going to be unpacking it today. So I think let's just start off with one of the questions. So how do I know if I am addicted? So how do I know that I actually am addicted to something? Josh, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, Gerardus. I think that's a great question. I think a very common question. I think as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing, if I'm asking that question, I probably have a bit of a problem.
Right.
But I think there is a more practical way to look at it. And I think some of the things that we can look for in that in that question, in answering that question, is looking for some kind of common signs and symptoms that we can observe to operate in and around addiction. So things like loss of control, right? Unmanageability, so this level of like chaos, obsession, compulsion, progression, tolerance, and withdrawal. And we can unpack that maybe in more detail, but just as a high level kind of overview, that those would be some of the things that we would be looking at to check and answer the question: Am I really addicted?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, what we can kind of sum it down to in my mind is once I start, I can't stop. And once I've stopped, I can't stay stopped, So I would know, if I had to ask myself that question, immediately I would know whether if I'm in addiction or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Even though it's not as black and white in some cases, but
But that is quite clear. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's good. Cool. All right. The next one we have here is what is the best way to overcome a dual addiction? So the way that this person has phrased it, they've given the example of pornography and masturbation, both of those being an addiction. What advice do you give someone who finds that they have kind of multiple addictions, essentially, or dual addictions?
Well, I think firstly, it's really not that uncommon to have some dual processes going on.
Right.
I think it's more common than we think. So I think if there's this preconception that it's suddenly 10 times harder because there's two things going on, it's not necessarily the case. There is maybe a level of complexity that is added.
Right.
But I think a good answer or a good approach to that would be the same as if I was just dealing with one addiction.
Right.
And I think probably and the way that I approach dealing with an addiction is, so if we were to look at some of those common signs and symptoms that I referenced in the previous question, those are things that people would relate to. It's not hard to observe a loss of control within myself or in someone else over time. It's not hard to see the chaos that builds. People have a reference point for that. That's easy to see and observe. And I think we have something we call the iceberg model, which is maybe a bit of a helpful analogy for us to go through to help unpack this question a little bit.
Right.
But those common signs and symptoms come together in what we call the cycle of addiction, which operates at the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
And where we really want to get to work is beneath the surface, where 90% of this problem of addiction sits. Right?
Right.
There's a whole bunch happening beneath the surface, and this is where we really want to get to work. And just as a brief snapshot of what some of that stuff could be, it could be like denial, it could be isolation, it could be spiritual disconnection, it could be they're different for different people, but this is where we want to get to work. And so if you're talking about two addictions going on, it's not so much the addiction that's the focus, or the substance, or the process, or the behavior. It's what's going on beneath. What are the things in us and around us that are driving that behavior and that addiction? So simple answer, exactly the same as you would deal with just a single addiction, really.
Sure. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, look, we know that addiction is multifaceted. Right? And I've mentioned this before, right? And because it's multifaceted, it's absolutely important for me to have a holistic approach, all right, to my addiction. And as Josh said, there are these underlying issues, right? These maladaptive mechanisms that keep the cycle of addiction up and going. So for me, it boils all the way back down to a culture, right? You know, so if I'm able to move as far as the East is from the West, which is the point of me having to now engage in a recovery process, right, is to have a complete and a radical change, right, and start identifying or creating a new identity within recovery. You know, and the process to get to that is similar with any addiction.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah. And just to quickly add, it's not to say that the processes behind this is a one-size-fits-all. Absolutely not, you know, because each individual has their own unique circumstance and situation. You know, so it's a matter of having to unpack these maladaptive mechanisms as to
It's quite a mouthful, hey?
Yeah, it is.
Maladaptive mechanisms.
I was actually going to ask, can you unpack a little bit what maladaptive mechanisms mean to those who don't know?
Yeah, so as Josh was actually saying, you know, these maladaptive mechanisms, we're talking about things like flawed beliefs, you know, we're talking about character defects, right? Because all is well, right? For example, I can speak from a point of I can say substance addiction. Right? Addiction to substances, right? Believe it or not, there's more behaviors that are born from that because of the cycle and the culture that I still need to work on. And those behaviors are the very same things that you can find in, I would say, behavioral addictions as well. You know, the isolation, the secrecy, all of these things, the flawed beliefs, you know, the shame, the guilt, you know. So hence, when we go down and start digging into those things, that's where the true healing and restoration starts taking place.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like those, so a bit of a mouthful to say maladaptive mechanisms, but they're the things that sit underneath the tip of the iceberg, the things that support the cycle happening on the surface, the things that are maybe a bit harder to see. But those are the things that that need to be intentionally disputed and dismantled, and that is the focus of like a meaningful and sustainable recovery journey. It's like if we look at the cycle happening on the surface, like we're just going to get stuck, and we might be able to interrupt it temporarily, but over time there's nothing sustainable. And so those maladaptive mechanisms, the things we're going to keep bringing it back to the iceberg, right? That's going to be the analogy. And so that's where we want to start looking beneath the surface. But mouthful, maladaptive mechanisms, but that's really the key to a meaningful and sustainable recovery journey.
That's good. Yeah. Sure. Thanks, guys. Cool. Well, let's head to the next question. So, how do I know I need to enter addiction therapy if I think I'm just a weekend drinker or a social drinker? So, I just do it every now and then. Why must I come to addiction therapy? You guys want to give that a go?
Well, I can only bring it back to my personal experience, right? Which I think is fair, you know, because everybody has their own personal experience when it comes to this particular question. I bring it back to culture, right? I was raised in a culture where there's certain things that were dysfunctional, but I didn't believe that they're dysfunctional because everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
Right? But it only took a certain level of understanding as to what addiction actually is and how it affects not only me, but the people around me. For me to start kind of, that's when the penny drops. It says, no, wait, hold up a bit here. What is it that can maximize my potential, to become a better version of myself? What can I get rid of? What can I change and evolve within myself, to maximize my potential? And this is not strictly limited or exclusive to just addiction only. Even if I wasn't addicted to any substance whatsoever, and I'm purely a supporter, right?
Yes.
I can actually follow through the very same process and say, what is it that I can learn? What can I equip myself with to discover or rediscover a new version of myself and a better version of who I am in this
That makes
circumstance?
sense.
It's quite interesting because it links back to the first question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And even more so, like my response to this question would be like, okay, if this is what I'm asking, perhaps I know that I might have a problem. That's the space I'm going to be asking this question from. So there's reason for like, okay, there might be something up here. But I think again, bring it back to the common signs and symptoms. So if I'm saying, okay, I'm only a social or weekend drinker, I need to look at things like, okay, am I losing control in my behavior? Am I able to stop and stay stopped? Are things becoming more chaotic, in my life? Am I becoming obsessed with, even if it's just on the weekend, like, am I becoming obsessed with that behavior on the weekend?
Sure.
Like, am I compelled to do it? Can I walk away?
Yeah.
Is it getting worse over time?
Yeah.
What is it worse now than it was maybe a year ago? Am I able to tolerate more and more alcohol over time?
Sure.
Things like that can really help put it in perspective.
And like also like, is what I'm doing affecting other aspects of my life? I think that's also like a very important thing, because I mean, when you look at the youth today, I mean, guys love going out for a good job, and a good party, right? But the difference is somebody else may not make it to work on Mondays. A pattern starts forming. I lose my job. It started affecting my life at home, my family at home, my kids at home. So yes, it may seem like something that is innocent because everybody's doing it, but how is it impacting every other aspect of my life?
It's very good.
I think if I start realizing that it's actually having a negative impact on these other aspects of my life, I need to kind of look into it.
And it's really that introspection that is really helpful in this, and so that's actually a good place to be asking that question is, well, how do I know? How do I actually know that this is a problem for me? I might have a suspicion, but I want to be able to say, okay, I do have a problem. Let me make some changes. Let me move forward. I mean, I think another interesting thing, and this could perhaps be a bit of a misconception, is that, like, if I just do it on the weekends, that in between I'm not using the substance, and therefore I'm not like in addiction. And if we again, back to the iceberg, back to the cycle of addiction, that cycle is made up of acting out a loss of control, unmanageability, obsession, and compulsion, and it just loops around and around and around and around. Acting out is just a part of that cycle. So I can go days or hours or days or weeks or months without acting out, but it doesn't mean that the cycle of addiction isn't in play. It doesn't mean that. And
that's good.
if I'm saying, cool, it's just weekend to weekend, perhaps I need to look at what's happening in between. What's my thinking like in between? What's the levels of loss of control? What's the unmanageability like in between? And so often we focus on the substance, that we miss what's going on around that, and we don't know what behaviors to look for. But this question is a great place to start, and then hopefully with some of the things that we've talked about that can help point people in the right direction.
So actually, you kind of mentioning almost a bit of denial maybe in some situations. So one of the questions here is, how do I break through my denial? So if I have denial, and like, how do I actually recognize it and break through it?
Sure, that's quite an interesting one. Is because like if I have denial, how would I know that I have denial?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
um, do you wanna go?
Yeah, look, sure. I believe that one gets a perspective of what's actually really going on if you give yourself an opportunity to get a perspective from outside the chess game, right? Meaning people around you, right? You know, so if somebody around me says, "Hey, man, Lolo, take a look at this, man. You know, I think there's a problem here." You know, as much as I can be in denial, but if two or more people are saying, "Hey, man, you need to take a look at this. There's perhaps a problem that you need to to take a look at."
Especially if they like not from the same like group of people, you know.
Yeah.
If a friend from this circle over here is telling me, "Oof, Josh, you got something that you need to get checked out here or like get sorted out," and then a family member over here and the work colleague over there, and they're all saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
That's maybe a good marker that I've got something I need to work on.
Absolutely. So, I mean, as far as denial is concerned, I mean, hey, man, perhaps just sometimes sitting down and listening to people that really care about you and that are speaking into my life, you know, will be a great start.
Yeah. Denial is a maladaptive mechanism as well.
Yeah.
So it is one of those things that sits beneath the surface that needs to be looked at. And I think what's important to understand about denial is that it is a protective mechanism of some kind.
Sure.
Like whether it's good or bad is a different question altogether.
Yeah.
But often denial protects me from some kind of harsh reality that is maybe too painful to bear or too overwhelming and so if I want to tackle denial in my life, I most likely want to put myself in an environment that can help support me through perhaps that pain or being overwhelmed or whatever that denial is protecting. And a great way to do that is through community. It's like who knows about addiction, like who's been there, who's done that, who understands that pain or that being overwhelmed. I think to be able to position myself in an environment where people are going to talk straight, and maybe where I get to hear it from more than one source, and then people who understand some of the recovery process, which we're not going to talk about here, but I think that would be a great place to center myself and to root myself if I want to deal with denial in my life.
It's very good. Nice.
Yeah. It's a powerful thing. If I can just say just one last thing as far as that's concerned is that I think one of the things, denial comes in different forms, right? I can minimize something, right? And say, look, I'm not as bad as the para down the road because the guy looks like he doesn't bath, he's not clean and he's living in the streets. But look, man, I can hold down a job, you know? I mean, I still got things intact. I got my sanity intact. And, you know, so that minimizing the situation, you know, is another form as well. You know, so I think, you know, that introspection of having to also get information from other sources, the community, you know, is quite an important aspect because addiction doesn't choose. It's not based on race. It's not based on religion. It's not based on profession. You know, when it hits you, regardless who you are and what profession you're in and the color of your skin. You know, so the more we get exposed to that kind of information, the more we have a better understanding.
And I think there's some, so that's great to actually point that out, Lolo, because like there's some markers that we can look for as well, like minimizing being one of them, maximizing is another, and I don't know if we've got time to go through examples, but so there'd be like minimizing, maximizing, justifying, intellectualizing, all these things help me to identify levels of denial in myself, but also potentially in other people. But I think it comes back to that community aspect as well, because I possibly need to be hearing the truth from more than one source to get to a point where I'm willing to accept that, okay, this is true, let me face up.
Yeah, sure. And in line with that, we've got a question here. what are some of the early signs of addiction that loved ones might notice? You know, so like you're mentioning those signs and symptoms. Like, what are some of the early sort of signs to see? Okay, this might be an addiction, or this might be heading somewhere. How would you answer that?
Sure. I think it's pretty simple, I guess. You know, isolation for one. You know, changing behavior as well. You know, and I'm not only saying that from a perspective of what I see from myself having to change, but how do I spot it in a loved one as well? You know, being a person who doesn't know what addiction is and what addiction looks like inside my home, right? How do I see these things? You know, so if I see Lolo and his personality completely changes, I don't have to see him picking up a substance. I don't have to see him engaging in dysfunctional behavior, you know, whatever it may be. But the moment I start seeing a change in his personality, in his character, the isolation, you know, the lying, you know, the stealing, you know, the financial unmanageability, you know, these kind of things are pointers. I mean, they red flags. And I think it gets to a point of saying, I need to step up and step into the space now, you know, and say, are you okay, Lolo? Are you right? You know, is there something that is going on that perhaps we need to sit down and unpack?
True.
You know, I think, you know, those are some of the signs and symptoms that one can kind of spot, you know, within an individual outside of you, within your own home.
Yeah. And I think in family it does become tricky, right? There's it does become challenging because often I want to believe the best of the people that I love, and yet if I start to suspect, hang on, this person that I love has something going on, then a level of suspicion starts to creep in, and like, where do I go from there? You know, like there's this conflict that starts to develop within me, and I think outside of just, so Lolo's referenced again the common signs and symptoms, the cycle happening on the surface, so loss of control and manageability, etc., etc. Great to be able to look for. But if I suspect that my family member or loved one is getting stuck in a bit of a cycle, again, I want to be tied into more than one voice or that is equipped and is experienced in this area to help guide the process, because the emotions, particularly when it comes to loved ones and family, can really swing judgment one way or the other. And it's helpful to have that kind of, so for me, it would be like a recovery community that I can anchor myself into, and that can help guide me through the process of, like, how do I engage with this loved one, even if I don't have a problem myself. It can help
Just
me
getting that
navigate that
support.
process.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, guys. Right, so we've mentioned behavioral addiction and substance addiction. So what are the difference between those two? Is there a difference? And if there is a difference, what's the difference?
Well, he's substance and I'm behavioral, so
Well, I'm
so maybe you should answer the question.
What's different about you two? No.
Look, I think in the beginning of our conversation, we kind of had we touched base on how dual addictions marry into one another, right? I'm substance, you know, I'm a substance guy, all right. But there's behaviors that started developing due to that, right? And that worked hand in hand with my addiction now, with the substance now. So much so that having to come into recovery from substances, I still had certain issues as far as behavior now is concerned that I had to put some focus on that were working hand in hand with my substance addiction, you know? And I mean, look, I'm going to put it flat out, right? I was using a substance, and within using that substance, the behavior of engaging in pornography and dysfunctional sexual behavior worked hand in hand. Right. So now, in the absence of the substance, I still had this behavior problem that I had to, you know, challenge that I had to overcome.
Makes
you know.
sense. Yeah.
So applying the very same principles and the very same processes with my substance addiction, I had to do the same with my behavior. So I would say it's pretty much it's the same thing. We can't. It's multifaceted, man. It's addiction. It's multifaceted. You know, I can't categorize it and say no. This is purely just substance, and this is just behavior. Because my behavior
They're
can
all
lead me
connected,
straight back to my substance.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting because like there are people finding that people much more qualified than I am in these areas, finding the same kind of like neurological and biological side effects in those using substances and those engaged in kind of behavioral addictions or process addictions as we'd call them, and we're finding increasingly that they aren't actually that different, and so we're finding that the kind of the way that we approach addiction needs to shift, and the focus needs to shift away from. It's not just about substances, right? It's about more than just substances. It's about behavior as well. But even that is not enough.
Yeah.
Because it's not about a chosen substance or behavior, but rather the dysfunctional ways that I engage with that substance or behavior.
Absolutely.
And that is the way that we approach that is the same. Coming right back to the iceberg and the maladaptive mechanisms.
That makes sense. All right, yeah. So thank you guys for tuning in today and just sharing from your perspective and everything. Yeah. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, so that's the end of our episode for today. So if you want to know more about Project Exodus, then go onto our website, www.projectexodus.net. And if you have any other questions you would want us to ask in future episodes, be sure to go on our website and just send those questions to us. And lastly, make sure to share this podcast with a family member or a friend who you think might benefit from hearing from what we've shared about today. And yeah, we'll see you for our next episode.